In the final decades of the 2nd century BC, the Roman Republic confronted a threat unlike anything it had expected from the distant northern lands. Consul Gnaeus Papirius Carbo marched with confidence to aid Rome's Tourisci allies, believing that the migrating Cimbri and Teutones could be intimidated or crushed before ever posing a real danger. As Carbo approached the passes near Noricum, he imagined the triumphal procession he might win if he defeated these wandering tribes. Yet the moment he prepared to establish a temporary camp, the ground shook with the pounding of war drums. Thousands of northern warriors erupted from the mist, their cries echoing across the valley. Surprised and unprepared, the Roman column struggled to form up before the charging mass slammed into them. Carbo's careful plans collapsed instantly as his army dissolved in chaos and terror. What he intended as an ambush became a calamity, marking the true beginning of the Cimbrian War. The conflict was born from Roman suspicion and misunderstanding of the Cimbri, a people likely originating from the region of the Jutland Peninsula. Little is known about their culture or even their ethnic identity, which ancient writers debated between Germanic or Celtic origins. Whatever drove them to abandon their homeland, the Cimbri set out with their families and warriors in what appears to have been a massive migration southward. Before encountering Rome, they clashed with the Boii in the Hercynian forest and were denied settlement by the Scordisci in the Balkans. Forced repeatedly to move on, their westward path eventually brought them into contact with Rome's allies in Noricum. The Tourisci could not repel the newcomers and sent word to Rome for help. Carbo answered swiftly, gathering around 30,000 men and marching north. Yet when the Cimbri and Teutones sent ambassadors to him, their demeanor was not hostile but apologetic. They claimed they had no intention of harming Roman interests and would willingly withdraw from allied lands. Carbo agreed outwardly, but secretly ordered his guides to lead the tribes along a path where he hoped to ambush them. The Cimbri soon discovered the deception. Rather than being trapped, they reversed the situation and struck the Romans near Norea with overwhelming force. The sudden attack shattered the Roman column. The towering northern warriors, with their pale eyes and fierce momentum, sent panic through the legionaries. Only a violent thunderstorm and the cover of nearby woods allowed a few survivors, perhaps 6,000 in total, to escape. Carbo himself survived, but returned to Rome in disgrace, condemned not only for defeat, but for treachery. Horrifying stories of the towering barbarians and their priestesses circulated through the city, fueling fear of an enemy who seemed both alien and unstoppable. Yet the Cimbri did not invade Italy. Instead, they moved west into Gaul, giving Rome an unexpected but temporary reprieve. By 109 BC, the threat resurfaced when the migrating tribes reached Transalpine Gaul, now a formal Roman province. Consul Marcus Junius Silanus attempted to stop them, but his army suffered a devastating defeat similar to Carbo's. Again, the tribes did not march into Italy, but continued their wandering. The Tigurini, allies of the Cimbri, raided Roman lands and incited a revolt among a client tribe, escalating Rome's troubles. In 107 BC, another army under Lucius Cassius Longinus initially defeated the Tigurini, but later fell victim to greed. Lingering too long to seize captured wagons, Longinus gave the enemy time to regroup. He was killed in the ensuing ambush, while his surviving legate, Caius Popilius Laenus, was forced into a humiliating surrender. Rome now had 3 catastrophic defeats to its name, and no buffer left between its territory and the approaching tribes. A slight success came in 106 BC when Consul Quintus Servilius Caepio crushed a rebel tribe and seized the legendary treasure of Tolosa, though the gold mysteriously vanished en route to Massilia. But events that followed overshadowed any scandal. In 105 BC, a new consul, Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, was charged with ending the northern threat. His appointment angered the aristocracy because he was a new man without noble lineage. Caepio, serving as proconsul, resented taking orders from him. Their rivalry and refusal to cooperate would ruin Rome. When the vast Cimbrian host approached the settlement of Arausio, the Romans were disastrously divided. Scaurus, Mallius's legate, was killed after refusing to aid the enemy. Caepio refused to join ranks with Mallius, even moving his camp across the river to avoid appearing subordinate. Their disunity delighted Boiorix, the Cimbrian king. With around 300,000 warriors, the northern tribes massively outnumbered the Roman forces. Worse, Mallius's men were positioned with their backs to the river, eliminating any escape. Envoys from the tribes asked for land and food, but Mallius rejected the demand. Caepio raged that he would have executed the envoys himself. Motivated by jealousy, he attacked prematurely. The Cimbri surged forward, descending on Caepio's isolated force like a storm. His men were annihilated. Survivors fled into Mallius's lines, throwing the Second Army into confusion. With panic spreading and no room to retreat, tens of thousands of Romans drowned or were cut down. The disaster rivaled Cannae and would be remembered alongside Rome's greatest defeats. The Cimbrian women fought alongside the men or executed captured Romans as sacrifices. Tales of priestesses reading entrails on the field horrified the survivors. Panic swept Rome. In desperation, the Romans revived the ancient and repugnant practice of human sacrifice, burying alive 4 foreigners to appease the gods. Yet even after such a victory, the tribes once again turned away from Italy. The Cimbri crossed into Iberia, the Teutones wandered Gaul, and Rome was granted one final chance to prepare. That chance came in the form of a general whose name would soon reshape Roman history, Gaius Marius. By the winter of 104 BC, Rome was drowning in grief and terror. The catastrophe at Arausio hung over the city like a suffocating storm cloud. Endless wails echoed through narrow streets and crowded tenements as families learned that fathers, sons, and brothers lay among the tens of thousands dead. Those who had not lost loved ones were haunted by the thought that the victorious Cimbri and Teutones might march on Italy at any moment. For the first time since Hannibal had descended from the Alps, Romans felt truly vulnerable. Rumors spread like wildfire, telling of prisoners strangled, horses drowned in the freezing waters of a Gallic river, and terrifying priestesses committing grotesque rituals upon the wounded. The psychological blow of Arausio shook the Republic to its core. Yet just when Rome seemed doomed, hope appeared on the horizon in the form of 2 returning generals. Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla were sailing back from North Africa with Jugurtha, the defeated Numidian king, in chains. News of their arrival sent waves of relief through the city, and the people clamored for Marius to take command of the war in the north. Despite aristocratic resistance, he was elected consul again, even though he was still absent from Rome. His unprecedented consecutive consulship shattered political norms, but fear overrode tradition. Rome needed a savior. Marius knew that rebuilding the army was essential. The Republic had never lost so many trained soldiers in a single day, and no reforms could undo such devastation quickly. Nevertheless, Marius set about transforming the legions from the ground up. While later generations exaggerated the extent of his reforms, there is no doubt that he strengthened training, reorganized logistics, and widened recruitment. For the first time, Rome relaxed restrictions on the landless poor joining the army. The Italians, whose sons had died in droves, were promised rewards for their continued loyalty. Marius inherited a reserve legion trained in Rome under the supervision of gladiatorial instructors, men hardened by the brutal discipline of the arena. Recognizing their potential, he molded the rest of his forces to match their standard. Volunteers poured in. Marius's earlier campaigns in Africa had made his veterans wealthy, and thousands of ambitious young Romans hoped for the same fortune. Taking this eager mass, Marius marched north toward the frontier, leaving Sulla to handle delicate negotiations and intelligence work. Alongside Sulla was Quintus Sertorius, a young officer whose daring escape from Arausio had already made him famous. While Marius drilled his troops relentlessly, Sulla and Sertorius acted as the eyes and ears of the Roman army, reaffirming alliances and gathering information on the movements of the tribes. The Teutones and Cimbri, meanwhile, were not heading toward Italy as Rome had feared. They wandered west toward Spain, leaving Marius time to fortify and train. He built a massive stronghold near Aqua Sextiae, dredged the mouth of the Rhone to improve supply routes, and constructed canals to keep his forces provisioned. He drilled his legions day after day, marching them across hills, through forests, and over rivers, until they moved like a single breathing organism. The army that emerged was not merely reformed, it was reborn. For 2 years, Marius waited. He knew the tribes would return, and the Romans demanded vengeance. In 103 BC, he was elected consul yet again, this time in absentia. Then word arrived. The Teutones and Ambrones were moving east, while the Cimbri advanced toward the Alps. Marius divided his forces. Quintus Lutatius Catulus was sent with Sulla to block the Cimbri in the north, while Marius marched to confront the Teutones and Ambrones head-on. What followed became one of the most brutal and extraordinary chapters in Rome's history. The Teutones arrived at Marius's fortified position and launched massive assaults, hurling themselves across trenches, embankments, and showers of Roman missiles. Day after day they attacked, only to be repelled with heavy losses. Enraged and frustrated, they abandoned the siege, hurling insults at the Romans as they marched toward Massalia. The moment the tribes disappeared over the horizon, Marius dismantled his camp and pursued them. His soldiers, hardened by endless exercise and freed from the heavy baggage trains of older armies, moved faster than any Roman force before them. Near Aqua Sextiae, Marius chose his battlefield on high ground overlooking a stream. The Romans were thirsty, and Marius told his soldiers that if they wanted water, they would have to earn it with blood. That night, Roman camp followers descended to the stream and stumbled into bathing Ambrones. A brawl erupted, drawing more and more tribesmen into the fray. The Ligurian auxiliaries heard the Ambrones shouting their tribal name as a war cry and charged in fury. Fighting exploded along the bank, and Marius finally unleashed his legions. The Romans stormed down the slope like an unleashed tide, driving the Ambrones into the river and slaughtering them by the thousands. The water ran red with blood. Women rushed from the tribal camp, hurling themselves into the fighting to defend their kin or prevent their capture. The Ambrones were almost annihilated, yet the Teutones remained. That night, the Roman camp held its breath as the tribes screamed in rage from the darkness. No attack came. At dawn the next day, Marius let his exhausted troops rest, while 3,000 Roman cavalry under Claudius Marcellus quietly slipped away to a concealed position. On the morning that followed, the Teutones finally emerged in full force and raced up the hill toward the Roman lines. Marius calmly ordered his men to wait until the enemy drew near. A devastating volley of javelins cut into the charging warriors, followed by another and then another. The momentum of the Teutones faltered as bodies piled up the slope. Then Marcellus struck from behind. His cavalry thundered out of the woods, smashing into the rear of the enemy line. Panic rippled through the Teutones as the Romans pressed from the front, and cavalry tore into their flank. The tribes broke and fled toward their camp, only to be hunted down without mercy. Plutarch later claimed that 100,000 were killed. It was one of the most decisive victories Rome had ever won. Marius emerged as the unchallenged hero of the Republic. With the Teutones and Ambrones destroyed, he prepared to march north to join Catullus and confront the Cimbri. One last reckoning awaited, and Marius intended to finish the war that had begun with Carbo's failure years before. The savior of Rome was ready, and the final chapter of the Cimbrian War was about to unfold. As Marius crushed the Teutones and Ambrones at Aquae Sextiae, the northern gateway into Italy trembled under the shadow of the Cimbri. In the autumn of 102 BC, while the legions under Marius were busy delivering annihilation in southern Gaul, Quintus Lutatius Catullus and his deputy, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, held their position near the passes of the Alps. Their duty was simple but terrifying: prevent the Cimbri from entering the peninsula. The enemy was unlike anything the Roman commanders had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of tribespeople, warriors, families, wagons, livestock, were pressing toward the Athasis Valley, and every scout's report made the horde seem larger, more restless, and more inevitable. Catullus marched his 6 legions north into the narrowing valley of the Athasis. As the walls of rock closed around them, shadow swallowed the army. Figures began to appear on the ridgelines above, Cimbri warriors watching silently, their shapes flickering like ghosts against the dim sky. The men felt the cold creep into their bones, and even veteran officers sensed the doom of being trapped between mountainous walls and an enemy who saw every step they took. Catullus planned to hold the line in the narrow pass, imagining a Roman Thermopylae, but Sulla and other experienced officers warned that staying in the valley meant certain destruction. The Cimbri could strike from above, encircle them, or simply crush them with sheer numbers. Catullus finally yielded to reason and ordered a withdrawal. They retreated just in time. The Cimbri surged down the slopes in pursuit, using their shields as sleds to slide over the snow and hurl themselves upon the Roman rear. The legions fought desperately, throwing javelins up the hillsides, forming makeshift rearguard lines, and pushing through the harsh terrain until they finally emerged into open ground. Exhausted but intact, they reached the Adige River. There, Catullus ordered camps to be built on both banks and a bridge erected to bind them together like a defensive net. If the Cimbri wanted Italy, they would have to break this Roman wall. But the Cimbri showed a kind of ingenuity that shocked even the Romans. When their first attempts to cross the river were thwarted by volleys of arrows and missiles, King Boiorix directed massive labor forces downstream. Roman scouts returned in disbelief, reporting that the tribes were tearing apart entire forests, gathering stones, and constructing what looked like a colossal dam. As the structure grew, the water level slowly rose, threatening to drown the Roman camps. Meanwhile, upriver, another immense group was lashing together huge rafts and tangled bundles of timber. At first, the Romans could not guess their purpose, until the dam upriver was opened and the current strengthened. The Cimbri launched their monstrous bundles into the flood, and these deadly waterborne missiles smashed into Roman palisades and the bridge with terrifying force. Trees, rocks, and timbers slammed into the walls as the river swelled around the defenders. Panic spread among the soldiers as the camps began to flood. Some fled outright. The position was untenable. Catullus ordered another retreat, but not in shame. Carrying their standards at the front to maintain order, the legions withdrew south, leaving behind a small detachment of 500 men to hold the camp long enough for the rest to escape. When the Cimbri overwhelmed this forlorn rearguard, they were so impressed by the defenders' courage that they allowed them to depart unharmed, a rare gesture in a war defined by mutual brutality. Italy lay open. The Cimbri poured into the northern plains, seizing food, wine, cattle, and whatever valuables they could find. They lived lavishly on the richness of the land, even though Rome still considered everything north of the Po to be part of Gaul. For months, the tribes indulged themselves, resting after years of wandering and war. Rome, however, was preparing. Marius, fresh from his victory, declined an immediate triumph and instead marched south to unite with Catullus. He accepted yet another consulship, the fifth of his career, and assumed command of a combined force of over 50,000 experienced legionaries and auxiliaries. When spring of 101 BC ripened the fields of northern Italy, the Cimbri prepared to cross the Po. That was when they discovered Marius blocking their path, his standards gleaming gold under the sun. Boiorix sent envoys demanding land for his people. Marius refused with cold finality, saying the Cimbri would find only burial ground. When the envoys boasted that the Teutones and Ambrones would soon join them, Marius laughed and ordered prisoners, noble warriors, battered, chained, broken, brought out before their eyes. "Your allies already have their land," he said, "enough to cover them completely." Shaken and enraged, the Cimbri agreed to battle on the Raudine plain. Marius and Catullus reached the battlefield first. They positioned their line so the rising sun would blind the enemy and the wind would blow dust into their faces. The morning mist concealed the Roman formations as they advanced. When the Cimbri finally saw the legions emerging through the haze, sunlight flashing off thousands of helmets, they believed the sky itself was aflame. Still, they readied themselves with grim determination, and their elite cavalry charged forward. The ground trembled as they closed in, white shields and animal-crested helmets gleaming. Marius waited until the last possible moment. Then a massive volley of pila crashed into the charging riders, killing men and horses alike. A second volley fell, then a third, ripping holes through the attack. The surviving riders wheeled back, only to collide with their own infantry columns surging forward behind them. Dust engulfed the field, and visibility collapsed. Amid the confusion, Marius's left wing suddenly struck the Cimbri flank with perfect timing, while Catullus and Sulla pressed the center. Panic spread through the Cimbri ranks as their cavalry collapsed backward into their own warriors, throwing the army into chaos before they had even touched Roman steel. The retreat turned into a disaster. Hemmed in by Roman infantry on three sides, the Cimbri fled toward their massive wagon fort. There their own women forced them back into the fight, screaming and striking them, choosing death over enslavement. But the Romans were already upon them. What followed was slaughter on an unimaginable scale. Tens of thousands were cut down, trapped between the Roman advance and the walls of their own camp. Women killed their children to spare them captivity. Many took their own lives. When it was over, the Cimbri as a people had ceased to exist. The Battle of Vercellae ended the greatest northern threat Rome had faced since Hannibal. Only a few hundred Romans died, while over 100,000 of the enemy lay dead on the plain. Marius returned to Rome triumphant, now hailed as the savior of the Republic. His bond with Sulla still held firm, and the Republic basked in the glow of its deliverance. Yet beneath the glory, history was quietly shifting. Rome had won the Cimbrian War, but the path ahead would lead not to unity, but to the bitter rivalry that would one day set Marius and Sulla against each other and plunge the Republic into civil war. When the dust of Vercellae settled, and the plains of northern Italy lay silent under the weight of Cimbrian corpses, Rome celebrated as though the Republic had been reborn. The crisis that had threatened to devour the state was gone. The barbarian nations who once terrified every Roman household, utterly erased. Gaius Marius stood at the height of his power, hailed by soldiers and citizens alike as the third founder of Rome. Yet even as victory songs echoed through the city, the foundations of the Republic were shifting. The triumph over the Cimbri did not usher in harmony, but instead opened the door to a new struggle, one that would tear Rome apart from within. Marius now possessed unmatched prestige, and his soldiers worshipped him with the devotion normally reserved for monarchs. His reforms, though born of necessity, had transformed the Roman army into a force whose loyalty belonged not to the Senate, but to the general who trained, paid, and rewarded them. For now, this loyalty benefited the Republic, but its consequences would echo long after the Cimbri were forgotten. Catulus, who had shared command on the Raudine plain, received a portion of the credit for the victory, though everyone in Rome knew that Marius was the true architect of salvation. Sulla, whose cavalry maneuvers had played a decisive role, returned with rising ambition, his reputation growing behind his calm smile and aristocratic poise. But beneath the surface, the seeds of rivalry were already sprouting. Sulla, proud and aristocratic, believed he had contributed more to the northern campaigns than the public acknowledged. The soldiers who served under him praised him openly, and his confidence in his own destiny deepened with each retelling of his exploits. Marius, now aging and weary, watched the younger man's ascent with quiet unease. The Republic had room for many commanders, but only one could stand at the pinnacle. For the moment, however, both men masked their uneasiness beneath mutual respect, still united by the memory of the war they had fought together. Rome soon resumed its usual rhythms, political debates, senatorial schemes, and the jockeying of ambitious families. But the aftershocks of the Cimbrian War lingered. The Italians, who had bled heavily in the wars, demanded citizenship and equal rights. They had fought and died alongside Romans, yet remained second class. Their grievances, ignored for decades, now gained momentum. Marius sympathized with them, partly from genuine conviction and partly from political calculation. The aristocrats in the Senate resisted every attempt at reform. The city was swelling with veterans returning from Gaul, many landless, many expecting rewards that the state struggled to provide. In the midst of this delicate moment, Sulla grew restless. His brilliance on the battlefield had proven his worth, and he believed he deserved a command of his own, something grand enough to rival Marius's legacy. When war flared again, this time in the east, where Mithridates of Pontus was rising against Roman authority, Sulla saw his opportunity. The Senate, composed largely of his peers, favored him for the command. But the people, inspired by Marius's legendary victory over the tribes and longing for the familiar face of their savior, pushed Marius forward once more. The tension between Senate and people sharpened, and soon the question of who would lead the army against Mithridates split Rome in two. The victories over the Cimbri had given Rome back its confidence, but they had also fed the ambitions of men who now believed the Republic could be shaped by their will. The unity forged in the fires of war dissolved as swiftly as it had formed. The veterans of Vercellae, loyal to Marius, stood ready to march if he called them. Sulla's supporters, confident in the law and in his patrician standing, gathered around him. What had begun as a clash of personalities grew into a struggle over the soul of the Republic itself. Thus, the triumph at Versailles, which should have marked the dawn of renewed stability, instead marked the beginning of a darker age. The war against the Cimbri had saved Rome from destruction, but it had also cultivated leaders who would drag the Republic toward civil war. The victory that had united Rome now became the very force that would divide it. The last barbarian threat had been extinguished, but a new enemy, ambition unchecked and power without restraint, was rising from within. Rome's greatest danger was no longer across the Alps. It was in the hearts of her own generals.